Joining us from Brevard Zoo's education program. She's been Brevard Zoo's education program coordinator since 2012, where she oversees some really amazing programs that are education and conservation based, including their Lagoon Quest program, which is a fantastic one. I don't know if she's going to talk about it much today because she's going to be talking about another awesome program that she's responsible for, which is FrogWatch. So I encourage you all to join that program and get involved in monitoring for frogs. She was raised here in Brevard County, so she's a Brevard County native. She graduated from her own FIT. She got her bachelor's in marine biology, and she has, it sounds like, a lifetime passion for protecting wildlife and the natural world. And in her spare time, that's what you're going to probably find her doing, out hiking, bird watching, toad watching, traveling, and always looking for good places to eat. So please give a warm welcome to our presenter, Alana Wood. Sorry, Alana. Stay in the box.
Hi guys, thank you for joining me both in person and virtual. So like she said, my name is Alana Wood and I'm from Brevard Zoo. So for my online watchers, I am constrained to this little box, and normally I am very much an animated person walking around. So if my head tends to bop in and out of view, I do apologize. I will do my best to contain myself today, especially since I'm talking about a very exciting topic for myself, and that is frogs. And I'm sure for a lot of you, that is not necessarily something high on your priority list of being excited about, especially when you work at a zoo. Most people don't exactly think of frogs when you talk to a zoo person. It's not unusual for people to come and ask me about animals like our giraffes and our rhinos and our zebras, and now we have all kinds of new babies being born, but not too many people come and ask me about frogs. So this is a very exciting program for me because I do get to spread my love of the animals that are less appreciated, but definitely not any less important than the other animals that we have. So today is going to be focusing all on amphibian conservation, specifically with the FrogWatch program that I oversee. If you're ready for me, Steve, I'm ready for you. All right, sounds good. So anyway, very, very excited to be doing this. I've been overseeing FrogWatch specifically for about, gosh, probably 5 or 6 seasons now. But like it was mentioned, I've been with the zoo since 2012. So pretty excited to be here and to talk to you all. And I really appreciate all you guys coming out. So I look forward to the questions that you have at the end of our program as well.
We have a slight projector issue.
Slight projector issue. No worries. I can still keep on talking. So when it comes to FrogWatch USA, that is the program that I oversee. So I do have a PowerPoint. If we get it working, that's great. And if we don't get it working, that's fine too. I can still talk about frogs for hours. I don't need pictures if that's what it comes to. So FrogWatch USA is a citizen science program. And if you're not familiar with citizen science, what that means is we take people in the community. You don't need to have any background information about the subject. And what we do is we essentially train you as volunteer scientists to help us with amphibian conservation. Now, FrogWatch USA is called FrogWatch, but surprisingly, you do not need vision in order to do this program because we're not actually looking for frogs, we are listening for frogs. And that comes a little bit later in the program. And the reason for that is we have many, many species of frog here in Florida. We have over 35 species that we are aware about. Here in Central Florida, we actually cover 19 species. So that's a lot of frogs. And frogs range in size from very, very small to very, very large, and they can look very, very similar to each other. So it can be very hard to find them visually, but they all make very unique sounds that are very specific to their species. So it's actually easier to identify by listening than it is by seeing, especially because they tend to call a lot louder than to be visually seen. So how many of you have seen frogs at your home or a toad at your home? Because toads count. Yeah, so we know that they're around. And so what this conservation effort does is it helps us have a better understanding of the amphibians in our immediate environment, and it helps scientists with the data that is collected. So we do have a little bit more information with that, so we can get the PowerPoint working. If not, we'll figure it out. So when it comes to amphibians, the whole reason for this is, well, why? Why do we care about them? Like I said, most people, oh yeah, it's working. Most people don't come to me and say, oh, Alana, I'm so excited, teach me about frogs and teach me about toads. They want to hear about the exciting animals. So I'm gonna go ahead and move on. Awesome. So what can we expect today? So we're going to talk about what are amphibians, why should we care about amphibians, what is FrogWatch USA, and I kind of covered it just a little bit. How does it help? And then we'll actually have an opportunity to listen to some frog and toad calls. All right, super exciting. Next slide, please. Awesome. Next slide, please. Amphibians. So when it comes to amphibians, amphibians are going to cover a couple of things, which we're going to talk about in just a moment, but they appeared over 350 million years ago. So think about the first critters that are coming out of that primordial ooze, all right, onto land. So they are considered our oldest terrestrial vertebrates. So pretty exciting. We have over 8,000 species in the world. We know for a fact this is not correct because we are constantly finding new things every day. So it is estimated that we have over 8,000. I have seen this number drastically change from 5 to 9. So 8 seems to be the current accepted number. Again, that can change. That's just the way science works for the most part. We have amphibians on 6 continents. Do you guys know what continent we do not have amphibians on? Antarctica, and that's because it is way too cold. So we do have frogs and amphibians that do live in freezing areas, all right? They can't all just live in Florida. They also live in places such as northern Canada, but Antarctica, it just does not warm up enough for them. And that has to do with how they are made and that they are cold-blooded. So by being a cold-blooded animal, they are reliant on their environment for their heat source. If you put a coat on a frog, it's going to do nothing but make him look good. It's not going to help his body temperature at all. So they do need periods of time where it is warmer, and unfortunately Antarctica, it just doesn't happen. Antarctica doesn't have a lot going for it in that sense. Now, what makes them really unique as animals, because when you're learning about amphibians, especially in your younger elementary school, it can be really confusing, but they're super, super unique. And the big part is they go through metamorphosis. So if you remember that early childhood days, when you're learning about animals turning, throughout their metamorphic life cycles, frogs is one of them. So they start off as eggs, and as my father used to say, they're born as little swimmy things, and they have gills, and then they change over their lifetime and eventually turn into these hopping land animals, all right? And that's pretty fascinating when you think about it, especially considering that they had gills at one point. They eventually lose those gills and they actually become lungs. And to me, that's very, very fascinating as a mammal that cannot do that. So it's just a remarkable thing that they do. Now, unfortunately, that is a hindrance to their type of animal, which we will talk about in just a minute. By having to go through this metamorphic cycle, it actually has become a problem for them in common day. But their life cycle does require water. And that is a major point. So we do hear about more terrestrial amphibians such as desert toads. They still have to have water. They still have to have water to lay their eggs, and they still obviously have to have water to live. They just may not need it as much as other animals that we see in our life. So next slide, please. All right, this is the fun part. I'm going to say this like 17 times, by the way. This is the fun part, because to me, it really is all fun. All right, and I hope that comes off. So when it comes to amphibians, we do have 3 orders, okay? So we're going to kind of get into some taxonomy here. So we have our salamanders, all right, cute, fun face right there. And we have frogs and toads, which we're familiar with. And there is one more that I bet a majority of you have never heard of. Does anyone know what the last one is? I was not aware until I actually started my zoo career, okay? And Steve, if you can click it for me.
What do you want me to click?
Slide.
Oh.
There you go. Sicilians. They're an amphibian. They don't look like an amphibian. They kind of look like a weird looking worm snake guy, but it is an amphibian. It has to do with that metamorphic life cycle. It has to do with the gills, and it has to do with all those things we just covered being cold-blooded. Sicilians are a species we do not actively find here in Florida until recently. So all of these years I've been telling people Sicilians are not found in the northern United States. They're found more in South and Central America. They just recently pulled some out of a Miami canal. And that's really all the information I have. I think they're still doing further research on it, but it's very exciting to me that we have seen Sicilians here in the United States, especially so close to us here in Florida. But they range anywhere from that tiny little guy you see on the leaf to like a meter long, which is almost kind of terrifying. But they're essentially blind little guys that kind of live down in the muck there. But they are amphibians. We do not really focus on them for the FrogWatch USA part, but I do like to talk about them because they're cool. They're cool to look up. All right, Steve, next slide for me, please. So when it comes to frogs and toads, that's what we're going to be focusing on today. So they are known for being tailless amphibians. So not our salamanders, not our newts. Those guys have those long tails. These guys have tails when they're tadpoles, but then they lose them when they go through that metamorphosis. So general difference between frogs and toads, when you think about it, they kind of do. So I have a picture of a frog on the screen. I have a picture of a toad on the screen. And if you look at it, you can probably figure out who's who, right? Just by looking at it. So we do know that there are some general differences. And it's one of those things, there's always exceptions to the rule. But by looking at them, you can kind of figure out who's who, right? Let's talk about some of those differences. Next slide, please. So looking at frogs and toads, a lot has to do with their morphology and just how they function throughout life, like most things. So when it comes to frogs, they are slimy, they are slick, they are long, and boy, can they leap, okay? Those are the guys that are going far when they're trying to get out of the way. When it comes to toads, you're going to be thinking of the short little stumpy guys with short little stumpy legs, and they're typically drier. They're more what we consider a terrestrial animal, whereas frogs typically are living around an active common water source. Again, there's always exception to the rules, but this is just what we commonly like to say. Now, when it comes to frogs, one thing I found really interesting is they have teeth on their upper jaw, and toads do not. I would not try and test that theory, please. I don't want you guys going home and harassing the frogs and toads to see who has teeth and who doesn't. And just please don't. But I just thought that was very interesting how one has teeth and one doesn't. And when I see teeth, they're very, very fine. And it's most likely to help prevent prey from escaping out of their mouth. When you consider frogs are a little bit faster, they are probably going to be catching quicker prey, whereas toads, bless them, they're not that fast. But those are our general differences, and of course, there's always exception to the rules. Next slide, please. So we're going to be playing a game called Frog or Toad, and so Steve, you're going to have the joy of clicking on the PowerPoint. So next one for me. Frog or Toad, what do you think?
Frog.
Frog. General consensus is frog. Next slide. Yep, it is a green tree frog. So these guys are native here to Florida. They're all over the place if you're lucky enough to see them. Next one. Frog or toad?
Toad, yeah.
General consensus is toad. Let's find out. It is an eastern spadefoot toad. And see, these are also another native species that we'll find hanging out in our gardens. Next one. Frog or toad? This is when we start getting the conflicting answers and I'm not going to answers. Next slide for me. It is a Malayan horned frog. These guys are not native to our region. They are from Malaysia. So this is a species of frog, but they are very well adapted in camouflage to look like leaves. So those horns you see on the top of the head are actually to mimic leaf litter. So I used to have a picture of one in leaf litter, and you couldn't find it. And it was very hard to describe the frog that nobody could see. Next slide, please. This is the last one. This is the hardest one. Is this a frog or a toad? Yeah, nobody wants to play the game no more. I don't like it anymore. Let's find out. It's called an eastern narrowmouth toad. It is a native species to here in Florida, but if you click the slide one more time, it is not a toad. It's one of those scientific things where they named it a toad and realized, oops, we were wrong, but we're not going to fix it. We're just going to keep moving. So it is technically not a toad. They have since figured out that it belongs closer to frogs, but they're cute. They're about maybe yay big. They're very tiny, and they are probably the loudest animals that I've ever heard for their size. So we'll talk about their calls a little bit later on. So just kind of a general understanding of frogs and toads, but there's always exceptions to our rule, especially when it comes to our little eastern narrowmouth friend. Next slide for me, please. So why should we care? And that's going to be the biggest emphasis on this, of course. Next for me. Again, not everybody says, yay, frogs, let's save the frogs. I love frogs, unless you're a nerd like me. And that's why I'm here, is to help make you nerds for frogs as well. So why should we care about them? Obviously, we want to understand that any animal a part of the natural world does have some kind of importance when they're in their native range. That's pretty understandable, especially if you're listening to this chat and you're here today. I would like to hope that you already have that understanding. And if not, then great, we're learning something new today. But they're also very important for us as human beings. So one, they are predators and prey in the ecosystem. We live in Florida, and how many of you just love mosquitoes? You just, yeah, cannot wait for that backyard barbecue, right? Especially when, you know, you're trying to cook out. Now, obviously mosquitoes do play their part, but we want to make sure that they're being managed. So frogs and amphibians, they are a form of natural pest control, and they themselves are also a form of food. Think about all the wetland animals that live here in Florida, from your possums, raccoons, birds, snakes, alligators, they're snacking on frogs. So they are a very intricate part of the food chain here in Florida and throughout the world. But then when it comes for humans' sake, they're huge for medicine and educational research. Think about it. How many of you had to dissect a frog in school? A lot of you. Now imagine if you were to go on to become a medical doctor or an advanced scientist. You're probably going to dissect a few more. So very much an intricate part of medicinal research, and they're doing all kinds of stuff in terms of studying the characteristic properties of their skin and just how they function and their blood. There's a lot going on with research with our amphibian friends. So very important part for us as well, but it is important that we continue to move forward to help protect those natural resources so that we can protect these guys here. Because the big part is they serve as indicators of wetland health. And what that means is what's happening to our wetlands and what's happening to our amphibians very much go hand in hand. And if one is doing poorly, the other one is most likely doing poorly as well. Next slide for me, please. So this is when we get into the doom and gloom, everybody's favorite part. Don't worry, it gets better. And this is just to emphasize why we need to make sure that we stand up to do what we can to help protect these animals. So amphibian declines is significant. They are the most threatened animal with a backbone, which is pretty overwhelming. We know for a fact that over 40% of amphibians are in major decline. And we also know for a fact that several have gone extinct within my lifetime, and that's just what is known. That doesn't even account for what is unknown. Like I said, they're discovering species every day, so imagine what they're not catching. So this was taken by the International Union for Conservation of Nature and Natural Resources. And basically it's kind of like a profile of all the animals going on in the world and what's happening with their status. So the amphibians are doing pretty poorly, and there's a reason for that. And we're going to talk about that in just a minute. So yeah, next slide for me, please. So and a lot of it has to do with that really cool morphology, especially when it comes to their metamorphosis and how they are living as a type of animal, as an amphibian. And it's because they have semi-permeable skin. And what that means is think about all of the things that you put on your skin every day to keep yourself healthy. Shampoo, soap, lotion, a lot of hand sanitizer nowadays, sunscreen, all of those things. Now imagine if that got absorbed into your bloodstream on a regular basis. And that's basically what their skin is like. And when they adapted and evolved, that was advantageous for them. And as we now enter into a world where there is a lot of contact pollution, it is now a disadvantage for them. And that's a huge reason of why we're seeing their decline. Because think about it. If you are putting pesticides on your lawn, if they are spraying for insects into the water, these guys are the ones who are coming in contact with it. And if it's going into their skin, it's going into their bloodstream. And we're starting to see a lot of abnormalities. We're starting to see a lot of decline as well. So especially when you consider they have to have both land and water as part of their life cycle, these guys really don't stand a chance when you think about it. But the good news is that's why I'm here educating, and that's why we can always do small things to help impact our immediate environment, which is awesome. If you're familiar with the term canary in the coal mine, that's how we like to reference these guys. And if you were not familiar with the term canary in the coal mine, during the coal mining era, which has kind of since ceased, basically they would take a canary, which is a small bird, down into the mines with them, because birds have a more sensitive respiratory system, and they also breathe a lot faster than we do. So if the CO2 levels down in the coal mines were getting too high, or if there was a gas down there that was getting too high that they couldn't detect, the canary basically served as their indicator. And if the canary started not doing so hot, they knew they had to get out. So watching frogs is our canary in the coal mine for what's going on with wetlands. So obviously these pictures you see on the screen, not normal. That's not what our frogs should be looking like, but that is something that is happening. Next slide for me, please. So if you're familiar with conservation efforts around the world with any type of animal, you're going to be seeing the same things over and over and over and over again when it comes to why are we seeing a decline. So this really isn't anything new. Habitat loss and fragmentation. And a lot of people don't think about fragmentation. And what that means is, let's say you have this beautiful 5-acre lot of beautiful preserved area, and you really need to build a road to get from one town to another. So you build a small 2-lane road to go through your 5-acre lot. Well, space-wise, you really didn't take up too much. It really is a very small fraction of space that you just utilized for a small 2-lane road. But now you just cut that property in half. And now you have a barrier that the animals over here need to cross over the street to the other side. That's now a barrier for them. So that's what fragmentation essentially means is you may not necessarily be taking away a lot of space, but you're still breaking up their habitat. We're pretty familiar with non-native and invasive species here in Florida. That's kind of a hot topic here. And the same thing goes with amphibians. And it's not just invasive species in general, but also with frogs and amphibians, we have non-native invasive amphibians as well that are competing. So it's not just our pythons and the tegus and all that we hear on the news. It's other smaller species as well that we may not necessarily think are necessarily a problem. And then, of course, climate change, we know all about that and how that's a rising problem, as well as overcollection, because we talked about dissecting frogs in school. There can be overcollection when it comes to things such as the pet trade, the medical industry, as well as illegally being collected. So those are all sources that you want to look into to make sure that things are being done ethically. And then parasite and disease. There's been a huge, unfortunate fungus that is going around killing amphibians at a very alarming rate, to the point where extinction is very real and very likely for numerous species, and for some it already has happened. So that is something that is being researched currently that herpetologists and amphibian scientists are really pressing very hard to try and get under control, because it's rapidly spreading and it's killing amphibians at an alarming rate. So the discussion about how the fungus has come about has kind of gone back and forth. It could have been naturally introduced, just kind of making its way through the ranks as everything else has. It could have been unintentionally introduced by transport. So it's one of those things you can debate about it all you want. The problem is it's already here. So that's just something to think about. Next slide for me, please. So what's FrogWatch and how on earth does that relate to all of this? So the good thing about FrogWatch is it is much simpler than going out and saving the world, okay? And it's something that is very easy to do, that you can do from your own backyard. Next slide for me, please. So I talked about this a little bit in the beginning, so I'm not going to get too in depth with it since I already kind of introduced it. It is a citizen scientist program, so we connect people in the community that are just genuinely interested in helping to help input data for scientists. And basically you use your ears, and you would come to a training session, and I would train you how to do that as such and how to put in your data, and what's done is done. So it's really straightforward and very simple. Next slide for me, please. So what does the data do? Because it's all well and good, but you want to make sure it's contributing to something. So by listening to frog calls and by able to input what you hear, okay, on any given night that you hear it, it's going to describe everything from what's actually calling in your backyard. Are we discovering new species? Are we discovering that invasive species are spreading in a different manner? When frogs and toads are calling, what you're actually listening to here in Florida is you're hearing the males, you're not hearing females. So technically think about half your population, and they are calling to attract a mate. So when they are actively calling, you're basically hearing breeding season. And for Florida, that's very important. I mean, for all the states, it's very important, but especially for us, since we have a much warmer weather. So that's when we start looking into phenology and their life cycle. Maybe they're calling at different times that they normally weren't calling. And it basically just helps us get a better understanding of our natural world and the different trends that we're seeing, especially when you consider climate change and all the different environmental impacts that are going on around the world. Next one. So for FrogWatch USA specifically, and these numbers constantly change, that's why there's a plus after some of these, because I'm pretty sure the 165 chapters is already higher because we're constantly adding new chapters. So Brevard Zoo is currently a chapter, so that's my job. I come in, I train you guys. And so we're covering 41 states, including Alaska and Washington, D.C., which is incredible. Alaska actually had to jump through a lot of hoops in order to do FrogWatch USA because it is very strict science, and Alaska's daylight hours and nighttime hours are very, very different from ours once you go out through the season. So they actually had to jump through a lot of red tape to even get approved to do FrogWatch, which is still pretty incredible. We have several chapters in Florida, which is exciting. I'm going to be the closest one in terms of Central Florida. I believe the next one is down in West Palm and then Jacksonville, I believe. So I'm going to be your Central Florida region. And FrogWatch itself has been collecting since 1999. Brevard Zoo has been collecting since 2011. So 2011 we've been collecting. So it took a few years, but we got on it. All right, next slide for me, please. So this is when you start getting into the really fun part, because it's nice to talk about frogs and toads, but like I want you to actually hear them, because I'm sure several of you have heard frogs and toads in your own area and had no idea that's what you were listening to. When I was presented this program to take over, to give you like complete honest truth, I was indifferent to amphibians. I didn't dislike them, but I wasn't in love with them. And now I'm definitely in love with them. I've grown to love, like I have a painting of a toad in my house, like no lie. And when I started doing this program and listening to the calls, it was like an epiphany, because so many of these animals I've heard growing up my whole childhood here and had no idea that's what I was listening to. So when you think ribbit, no, I don't know who made up ribbit in terms of like, that's what frogs and toads sound like. It's totally false, because what we're going to be hearing today is not ribbit. Now, the good news is we are not doing all 19 Central Florida species. We don't have time for that. I'm going to be doing about 7 of them, which are the more popular ones you would hear in the area. And it's just more fun for you guys to listen to, in my opinion. We have about 300 species overall in the United States. This is rapidly changing, of course. And then again, over 8,000 species worldwide. Again, rapidly changing. Next slide for me. All right, so we're going to start off with the trusty bullfrog. This is going to be our biggest native species here in Florida. They are completely aquatic for the most part. So they're going to be the guys, if you have a pond or like a big retention canal in your backyard that has constant standing water, that's where these guys are going to be found. These are the big ones. So they sound very interesting, and you can see from the slide it has like really basic descriptions. My favorite one was actually said to us by a child, and that is lightsabers. So if you are a Star Wars fan, when Steve clicks the sound, you'll understand why. It's gonna sound like a lightsaber fight, and it's gonna be several of them calling. Maybe not, but that's okay. His computer's taking a minute, and that's fine. Well, what's really fascinating about amphibians and their calls is, like I said, none of them sound like what you probably anticipated. And several frogs species have actually different kinds of calls, and it can change in pitch and it can change in intensity depending on how much rain has there been or the humidity levels has there been, and as well as temperature. So there are some species of frogs that are winter breeders, which is not common. We only have a couple that are winter breeders. And keep in mind, when it comes to wintertime, our wintertime is not true winter. So if you're from the north, you guys get something called snow, and we don't. We get something called frost, which happens like 3 times a year, and then all the Floridians freak out about it. And that's really not enough to really deter our froggy friends. So a lot of our species will breed year round, but unfortunately that can't be contributed to FrogWatch because, like I said earlier, FrogWatch is very, very, very specific about their scientific protocols. So we actually have a season, which it can be kind of frustrating because I feel like it's very, very valuable data. So it looks like our audio isn't working, but that's totally fine. I can go ahead and obviously we can read and we can be described for you. And if we get it working, that's totally fine too. So we're the masters of improv when it comes to working in education, working with wildlife, because nature never does what you want it to do, right? And the picture you see on the side with the state of Florida, so the green, the intense green or yellowish color that you see, that is supposedly their range. Now you're going to see throughout the next couple slides that when it comes to the range, we know for a fact it's wrong. A lot of these are completely wrong, and that's why we're doing this data, because the ranges that we have on file are not the ranges that are true to life. Oh, an alarm call. That's a fun one. So a lot of frogs and toads, when they are being attacked, it is a form of defense that they literally scream. You can YouTube it, and it's ear busting, but it basically sounds like a cat that is very displeased, and it is a scream, and it's to deter their predators. So if you ever hear that in the middle of the night, you're probably hearing a frog that's being predated on. All right, so you can go ahead and click the next one. Green tree frogs, these guys are so fun. So these are little guys. They're only about, I don't know, maybe 1.5 inches long. They're typically bright, bright green. They're very popular here in Florida, but they're not always easy to find. And it has to do with competition with invasive species, which we will talk about a couple invasive species. So these guys, tree frog being true to the name, they're going to be found in your forested areas, but they really, really like living in residential areas as well. So you'll find them living like underneath shutters. You'll find them in your gutters. Not very uncommon there, so long as they're not being pushed out by an invasive. So these guys have, I guess, what you would consider a more traditional frog call. It's like a wonk, wonk, wonk. I'm very good at impressions, by the way, so y'all being blessed with my impressions. Okay, so they kind of make like a wonk, 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 and you'll be surprised just how loud these animals are. I mean, I'm talking like very distant away. It's not like it's from me to the table or, 10 feet away or 20 feet away. We're talking like a quarter of a mile away or more. These guys are very, very, very loud. So yeah, banjo string or a loose rubber band is kind of the way that we describe how they sound. All right, next slide for me. We talked about this guy a little bit earlier, how he's not a true toad, and he's what we call an eastern narrow-mouthed toad. He's actually a type of frog. One of the funniest stories I have with this is I had just taken over FrogWatch. All right, I was very excited to announce that we were having some FrogWatch training sessions, and this was at my job, what we call the all-staff meeting. So essentially the entire zoo is there, and our director, Keith, he goes, "What's the frog that sounds like the dying sheep?" And that's this guy here. Very, very loud. So with these guys, I have also heard them calling in the day. Often on my way home from work, I'm walking out to my car. It's 4:30, the sun's starting to set, and these guys are going off, going in the ditch. So they're very, very loud. They're very competitive too. They're one of the few species where most frogs and toads, when they call, they want to call not at the same time because they want to be heard. And if everybody's calling at once, the females cannot distinguish the difference between the males. Not with these guys. For them, it's a competition, and they all scream at one time, and then it'll be silent for about 3 seconds, and then they all scream again. And to me, it's very entertaining, but like I live a simple life, so to each their own, right? But again, these are very small animals. So an eastern narrow-mouthed toad, a big one, is about as long as the end of my pinky digit. So a lot of our native species here are on the smaller side. Our green tree frogs, maybe 1.5 inches long. Bullfrog's a different story. They're biggins, okay? They're big old biggins. And that has to do with swimming around in the aquatics. So go ahead and next slide for me. Oh, these are one of my favorites, but I'm gonna say that about everyone. Oak toads. Oak toads are very, 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 very tiny toads. Again, end of pinky. The end of my pinky is the size of an oak toad. These are possibly the loudest amphibians when it comes to their body size ratio. I will be in my car with the windows up, driving to my house, and I can hear them screaming from the outside through my car. They are very loud when they truly want to be. They also sound nothing like a toad or a frog, and they sound exactly like a peeping baby chicken. And growing up, I thought I was hearing baby birds at night. And, my 12-year-old mind didn't think twice about baby birds aren't awake at night, they're asleep. But that's exactly what they sound like. So this is one of those animals you probably have heard, and you just didn't know that's what you were hearing. They like to live in like a more of a sugar sand pine flats area. So where I grew up, it was a very it was not a developed area, a handful of houses in the back of Palm Bay type of deal. So they were everywhere. So they love the sugar sand. And when they get scared, it's cute because they'll get in the sand and they'll kind of like wiggle down and like, you can't see me. And they'll dig as fast as they can. I know, they're so cute. And they have that very prominent white stripe on their back. So they're one of my favorites because they're like all attitude and they're super, super tiny. Our little toady friend. The next one for me. So this is our cricket frog. We like to say click it cricket. That's one of my word verbiages to kind of figure out what they sound like. And if you take 2 glass marbles and you rapidly clack them together, that's exactly what they sound like. And these guys are rapid daytime callers. They're also very, very tiny, like the rest of our other species. So if you go out to, say, Stick Marsh or Three Forks Marsh, or anywhere where there is a lot of tall grasses and standing water, you're gonna hear these guys. So I'll often go out and do Three Forks Marsh, go on a nice bike ride, towards sunset, and these guys are going off. So they're really, really popular in those types of areas. So you may not necessarily hear them too much in your neighborhood unless you have a lot of really nice retention ponds. They're definitely a more aquatic species. So I like to say cricket because you take the glass marbles, you clack them together, and that's what they sound like. So this is the one species my husband knows because we hear them all the time. I like to question him and put him on the spot, and he doesn't know any of them. That's fine. It's okay. There's no prejudice there. But all right, next one for me, please. Southern toad. This is my #1 favorite, with oak toad being the second. I am definitely partial to toads. I really like the short, stumpy, dumpy little friends here. These guys, again, they don't sound like croak croak at all. They don't sound like ribbit ribbit. They actually sound like a high-pitched live wire. And this was another animal I grew up with my whole childhood and had no idea, because I did have massive industrial power lines that were behind my house, and that's what I thought I heard was the humming. And it's really these guys. It's a high-pitched hum. So the bigger the toad, the deeper the sound typically. So these guys are a high pitch. It almost sounds like white noise or singing. So a full chorus of southern toads like this, to me, is one of the prettiest nighttime sounds you can hear, because it really does sound like singing. They're amazing. I just love them. I just love toads. I'm very, very partial to toads. I love the unloved when it comes to animals. Oh, next slide. I went to click it and it was going to work. Oh, yes, the Cuban tree frog. Yes, our next and I believe our last species. Raise your hand if you've seen one of these guys. They are well known. I can almost guarantee you, if you've been in Florida longer than 3 weeks, you have probably seen one of these. The problem with Cuban tree frogs is they are very good at surviving, and that is not their fault. They are an invasive species here. They most likely got here by hitching a ride on a boat. I mean, I don't know about you. I cannot count the amount of times I'm driving down the street and I see a little head pop up from underneath my hood, and it's one of these guys. They're just good. They're good at surviving, and it's what they do. But it is creating a lot of real negative impact on our ecosystems, because I've been saying this whole time how our native species are so nice and small. They're an inch, inch and a half. They're really, really tiny. These guys can get up to be a solid 3 inches long. The females are massive. They're basically giant mouths with feet, okay? And they will eat anything that they can catch, including each other. Yeah, they are not picky. So, and that goes for any amphibian. They will eat whatever they can catch because they are technically carnivores for the most part. Now, what's distinctive about the Cuban tree frogs is they do have that really wide smile. They are quite large when they're full grown, and their little sticky toe pads are not that little compared to our other species of frog. They have those huge round toe pads to help stick to your face when you're trying to go into your house at night, and they jump off of your door and they land on your head. Yeah, that's what they're really, really good at. They also change color rapidly. And they're not necessarily born with one color and that's the way that they stay. I mean, their color can change, not chameleon-like. They don't have chromatophores like a chameleon or like a cuttlefish, but it also depends on temperature and humidity. So they can be very hard to identify visually. And they sound like squeaky shoes or wet shoes on a creaky floorboard. So when my husband comes home from fishing and he has his wet flip-flops on and he's walking down the walkway, it sounds exactly like a Cuban tree frog. It's like a wah, 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 wah. So if you've ever heard that in your yard, that's exactly what you're hearing. I have several that live in my wind chime, which is really entertaining on windy days and it's about to rain because it'll echo in the wind chime and then the wind chime's going. So you just hear, wow, wow, as they're being blown around. I'm like, go for it, guys. You got this. But unfortunately, this range that we see when it comes to Cuban tree frogs on the sheet here, you can't tell me that they're all throughout the entire state of Florida and then 3 isolated spots in the panhandle. Like, you can't tell me that. Like, we know that this is old data and we know it needs to be updated. I'm sure that they've probably advanced well into Georgia. And if climate change keeps going the way that it's predicted and we still keep getting warming temperatures, they will continue to expand. Now, the advantage of them being a tropical species is they can only go so far until a freeze line. And once there's a significant freeze line, it will cut them back. So they will be limited to the southern regions. That's why we have so many. All right, next one for me. This is a fun game. Is this a Cuban? This is probably the #1 question I get as a FrogWatch chapter person or somebody associated with frogs. The big questions I get always have to do with Cuban tree frogs. So this is the game we play called, Is This a Cuban? So they are labeled 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. And if you think any of them are not Cubans, or if you have a suspicion of who is a Cuban or who is not, you're welcome to share. Otherwise, you can keep it in your mind. Let's say a solid half of these pictures, if not more, were pictures taken by myself. So on my own property, and that's my hand actually holding the frog. So yeah, these are all really legit pictures. I'm gonna click the next one for the answers. Yes, all of them are Cubans. And it's to emphasize the fact that they can change color and pattern. They can't change texture because it is part of their body. But for example, #1 and #2, that is the same frog and the same plant at the same day. The only difference is that it had rained. And so his color shifted so that he, as a cold-blooded animal, the color shifted so that we could heat up or cool down depending what was needed. So it's an orchid. You can still see the same stem, the same leaves. But in one video, or I'm sorry, in one image, it had rained, and in the other image, it had not rained yet. But you can see the drastic variation. They range from basically being pale white to gray, bright green, brown, yellow, spotted, mottled, and that's just how they are. So they're very, very good at camouflaging. They're very, very good at hiding. But you see all those big sticky toe pads? Yeah, that's a pretty big giveaway. All right, next for me, Steve. So what can you do? Okay, we talked a lot about amphibians and we did talk about some doom and gloom, and unfortunately that does come with conservation, but what can you do about it? Because we don't want to walk away feeling like we're helpless. That doesn't help anything. And there's a lot you can do in your own homes, very simple things you can do. One, admire from a distance. We talked about that semi-permeable skin with frogs and toads, which means if you handle them, any chemicals or anything that you have on your hands can be transferred to them. So most people who handle amphibians professionally, they will use gloves or they will have their hands cleaned in a way that is not harmful to the animal. So even at the zoo, we do not handle our amphibians barehanded, and we don't do presentations with them like we used to in the past because we realized that was harmful and not good for their welfare. So we stopped doing that. Avoid chemicals on your lawn as much as possible. Now, I understand if you live in an HOA, that is very much outside of your control. But for myself, I don't use fertilizers. I don't use pesticides. I don't use any of those things. If I have fire ants, I will spot treat as much as I can because I don't want to negatively impact the amphibians as well as the local wildlife in my yard. I don't really care about weeds in my yard. I just don't. The animals like to eat them. So it's one of those things. As long as you don't mind, let it go. Let it go. Save the animals that way. Keep it natural. Try and plant native if you can. A lot of landscaping is very popular here in Florida, but the more native landscaping that you have, the more natural landscaping that you have, it's going to be more promising for all your wildlife, not just your amphibians. It's going to be promoting all of it. Be a responsible pet owner. So we ask, please keep your animals inside when not supervised or leashed when outside, including cats. So outdoor cats is a huge negative impact to our environment for numerous reasons, but especially for amphibians because cats like to catch frogs. But you also want to keep them inside anyway because a lot of frogs and a lot of toads, such as our Cuban tree frogs, they do have toxins. And if your animal gets a hold of one of those animals, it can cause your animal to get very sick and throw up and even swell depending on the animal. We do have cane toads here in Florida. We do have cane toads that are reaching Central Florida, which is another reason you want to keep your animals supervised as well, because a cane toad can absolutely kill your animal. And you want to make sure that you protect your own animals as well as the wildlife in your local, in your immediate area. Just like we see anywhere else when it comes to helping saving our planet, we want to reduce our carbon footprint. We want to make sure we save our natural resources as much as possible. All of these things will contribute to helping the environment just as a whole, as well as our amphibians. We do a lot of emphasis here on the Indian River Lagoon as well. All of those things you can do to help save the Indian River Lagoon are very similar things you can do to help save your amphibians as well. So you kind of see a trend going, right? It's kind of the same message being spouted every time, right? Maybe it's one of those things like, hey, we should probably listen to some of these things because everything is connected. And if we can help preserve one thing, then it's obviously going to help preserve another thing. And then of course, you can always visit me at the zoo and accredited zoos and aquariums, because maybe you're not so keen on the frogs. Maybe maybe it's not your jam, but you really like to come see the rhinos. Well, coming to the zoo and participating in those types of things helps us do conservation efforts to other animals, such as amphibians, okay? That's the beauty about working in an AZA accredited institution, is our money doesn't just stay at our zoo. It's not just to help feed our animals, it's to help global conservation efforts everywhere, including amphibians. So super, super excited about that. And then you can volunteer with me. If you're really into it and you're really eager, you can volunteer with me. We start trainings in the new year. We'll be advertising for trainings in the new year. And it's a one-time session. You monitor in your backyard for 5 minutes, literally 5 minutes of monitoring in your backyard. And that's your monitoring session. So if you can do that 4 times in a summer, total of 20 minutes throughout a whole summer, you're a FrogWatch USA volunteer. Pretty low commitment, not too shabby. The hardest part is literally getting to a training and sitting through a training. And if you can do that, if you can do this, what you're doing right now, you can totally do a training, because that's what this is. So awesome, guys. I think we're on our last slide, Steve. This is when it comes to question time. So this is a personal photo from my own home. That's my beloved toad that is now painted in my living room. So wild animal, not a pet, but I just fell in love with them. And so, yeah, because I'm kind of a nerd like that. But if you have any questions, please, by all means, you can throw it in the chat. Oh, I got questions already. Perfect. Thank you. All right. In order to participate with the program or survey, you need to live by a canal or standing body of water. Excellent question. You do not. When it comes to FrogWatch USA, if you have a drainage ditch in your front yard, which I believe is a requirement for everybody living in a household, you are now applicable to be a FrogWatch USA volunteer. That is it. 99.9% of my volunteers monitor their backyards. So sitting on their back porch, listening to the environment for 5 minutes, they record their findings, and that's it. So the more rural you live, you'll most likely hear more species. The more built up it is, less species you'll hear. It just means easy monitoring for you. Where I lived in my apartment, it was at Babcock and 192. And I still monitored a single southern toad he would call, just one. He was really trying hard. All right, and a greenhouse frog, and I still monitored. Now I live out Grant Valkyria area, and I'm surrounded by woods and property, and I have heard 16 of the 19 species on my property at home currently. Yes, that can be overwhelming. But yes, you do not need to have a big yard. You do not need to have a pond. You do not need to have a marsh in your backyard. You can be in an apartment. You can be out in the middle of nowhere, and you can absolutely monitor. Excellent question. If there's any else, please let me know. I'm all up for it. And if maybe you think about something later, my email is up here on the PowerPoint slide. It's Alana, my first name, ALANA @brevardzoo.org. You are always welcome to email me. Someone did ask a question before I came to the program today. I was asking about tadpoles and identifying Cuban tree frogs. That is my #1 question. It is very, very difficult to identify amphibians as tadpoles if you don't have a microscope and you really know what you're doing. I personally cannot look at a tadpole and be like, that's what that is, unless it's something like a bullfrog where their tadpole is this big, okay? That's a pretty obvious one, but I couldn't look at a Cuban tree frog tadpole and know that's what that is. Unfortunately, you have to wait till they get into their froglet stage, which is the name of a baby frog, fun fact, a froglet. Then you can kind of figure it out. So when it comes to Cuban tree frogs, they're the masters of survival. If you have a bucket with water in it, if you have an old shoe with water with it, if you have an abandoned pool with water in it, they will lay their eggs in it. They will find a way to do it. So just got to take those precautions and try not to have standing water if you want to avoid frogs laying tadpoles or laying eggs to turn into tadpoles in your area. So absolutely. Yes, Steve, you have a question.
We have an online question about, are there frogs and toads with tongues?
Ooh, yes. They absolutely have tongues and they are very sticky. So think of frogs as like a mouth with feet. Frogs and toads, think of them as mouth with feet, and they throw their mouths at food. But they have those tongues as well. They're pretty coordinated, but a lot of times they miss. But it's super, super sticky. They will grab their prey, which is anything that moves, like it is actually really entertaining. Anything that moves. When they pull it into their mouth, you will always notice a frog and toads blink. They will always blink when they eat. And the reason they blink is their eyes physically go down into their head and push the food down their throat, which is really weird. But yeah, so now you're gonna go and you're gonna like be looking for a frog and like, I'm watching it. Y'all getting on YouTube right now, frog eating, but you'll always see them blink and it's because their eyes physically push the food down their throat. But yeah, they tend to eat first and ask questions later, which is also very entertaining. Excellent question. Any more?
Yes, we have another question.
Yeah, go for
What
it.
is the favorite food of the frog and the toads at the zoo?
Ooh, okay. So at the zoo, everything gets a very high quality diet, including our frogs and toads. They love crickets. They love crickets. They love mealworms. And we do have a couple of African bullfrogs, which I'm going to put this down for a minute. And our big boy is, he's probably about that size. So remember how we talked about those teeth only in frogs? Yeah, the African bullfrog has teeth. And he's one of those, we use a tong to feed because you don't want these getting in his mouth. And he actually gets, he'll get small mice actually, because he's so big. Yeah, like he's so big, he'll actually eat really, really small mice. So yeah, the ones at the zoo, I mean, honestly, we could put anything in there and they'd probably eat it, but to make sure that they're getting healthy food that isn't contaminated without parasites and things like that, they get crickets and mealworms for the most part. No salad for them. I love the questions. Like these are the good questions. I like hearing about it. Excellent. Of course, if you want to ask me anything, you're welcome to email me. Absolutely.
Anyone have a question here?
Everyone knows everything there's to know about frogs and toads now. I've done my job. I see a hand up.
The question was, I may have missed it,
No worries.
but their calling is generally done during the summer and not in any other seasons?
Correct. So with FrogWatch USA's seasonal protocol, you can start monitoring February 1st, which is still chilly for most of them. But here in Florida, they will absolutely call in February, and it goes until August 31st. Now, here in Florida, our summertime heat lasts a bit longer than other states, so we will hear calling outside of those times, especially hurricane season. But unfortunately, FrogWatch, we cannot input data outside of a season. And that's why it took so long for Alaska to get approval, because their daylight hours are very, very different, because we also do it at nighttime. We don't actually monitor during the day. We do it at night because that's most likely when frogs and toads are going to be calling. So there's actually a sunset protocol as well. So yeah, summertime is it, because rainy season for Florida, and it's nice and warm, and that's the perfect time for them to have babies. They love it. So the best monitoring, the best frog and toad call I've ever heard was during Hurricane Matthew. And it was going on. And of course, being a Floridian, I have to open the door to see like what's happening outside, and all the frogs and toads are going off. They were having a hurricane party. So it was still warm and it was wet, and they were very stoked. Good question.
Would you have, is there a method that is recommended to kill tree frogs?
Yes, and that is a question I get quite often when it comes to Cuban tree frogs. So I am going to state this as very factual as I can as a representative of the zoo. Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission and the University of Florida has excellent resources on the most humane way to ethically euthanize Cuban tree frogs. Obviously, here in the state of Florida, we have a huge problem with invasives. To be clear, it is probably most likely impossible that we will ever eradicate Cuban tree frogs. They are established here. It's just a matter of your immediate area. How much do you want to contain that population? So if you go on there's the University of Florida Extension, and there's the Florida Fish Wildlife Conservation Commission. They do have pages on how to ethically euthanize. And that is a very personal decision, a very personal choice, which I respect either way. You're also welcome to email me as well, and I can send those links to you.
Thank you. We did have technical difficulties with our sound, and we do apologize to everybody about the sound issues.
I mean, my impressions are pretty spot on, so you're all going to have to just
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you. The
Yes.
frog whisperer.
What is there a site, or how can we follow up to deliver these sounds that we weren't able to deliver?
Excellent question. So again, University of Florida Extension actually has an excellent resource on all frog and toad calls in Florida, as well as Central Florida. I have those links as well. So if anyone's having a hard time finding those things online, you are welcome to email me, and I will send those links specifically, because the sounds that I use for FrogWatch are in a little file, and I can't send them all. It'll like completely overwhelm your email, but I have lots of really great informative links online that I can send, including insect calls, because a lot of people hear insects and thinks they're frogs and toads too, and they're not. So all the beauty of training people how to listen for animals.
Are you right? This is an interesting question.
Yeah.
If you do have containers outside that are collecting tadpoles of invasive species, what is the best way to manage those containers to not further the spread of the growth of these?
Of course, the best thing is always going to be prevention. And if you can prevent containers from collecting water long-term, then that's great. So when it becomes rainy season, I will turn everything over, or I continuously dump everything. If you already have tadpoles in there, again, it is very, very hard to identify what is a native and what is not as a tadpole stage. So to know that you are managing Cuban tree frog tadpoles would be almost, I don't want to say impossible, because it's not, but it would be next to impossible if you are not essentially a herpetologist and you know exactly what that is. So that would be a very personal decision as to how to relocate or to essentially dump them. It's essentially when they become froglets that you can identify them better. But the best way is just don't have any standing water. If you have like a fountain in your yard, that's typically fine. Keep it cleaned regularly. But when it comes to frogs and tadpoles, they can't lay their eggs where there's rapidly moving water. All right. They're not going to be laying their eggs in these massive rivers. So if you have something that's constantly flowing really well, they're not going to be able to do that. But frog eggs and frog tadpoles are a food source for a lot of animals. So that's also something to consider.
We have a two-part question.
Go for it. Good.
How can we utilize frogs or some kind of frog program to help manage our mosquitoes? Can we have a frog army?
I would love personally to head a frog army. That's like my life goal. Honestly, the best way to do it in your immediate area is, again, kind of like what can you do at home? Don't have fertilizers on your yard. Don't do pesticides. If you can establish native plants, and they actually have a movement to like build your own backyard native frog pond. And I'm not talking pond like massive. I'm talking small isolated areas that encourage amphibians to lay their eggs and to be a part of your habitat. And they will absolutely help it control the insect population. And like, gonna step off the frog soapbox for a second, install a bat box. All right, if you live in an area where you can have a bat box, install a bat box. And that's also gonna help your mosquito population as well. It's gonna help keep that in check. But for the most part, as Floridians, we do have to accept the fact that we will always live with insects, and it's always going to happen. We cannot eradicate them completely, and that's when we have to take our own preventive measures. It's just the part of living in the South. Good times.
Are you aware of any Brevard County mosquito control initiatives to up their efforts against eradicating mosquitoes?
So the big push right now is, of course, bat boxes. The more bat colonies we can establish, then the more mosquito control we have. In terms of anything specific for amphibians, I'm not aware of. Otherwise, the only insect control that we really have is the traditional spraying that we see in the summertime, where they come around the trucks with the big lights going and they spray everything. So that's, unfortunately, those are the only sources that I know right now.
Is the mosquito spray bad for amphibians?
That is something I not have personally looked into myself. Based on what I know, I don't know of any sprays that are safe for amphibians that isn't water. So that's my comment there. But without having additional information of exactly what they're spraying, I can't make an informed statement, if that makes sense. But there's very little spray I am aware of that you can put on an amphibian that would be safe that isn't pure water.
So to close out our Q&A session, we have a couple questions about the FrogWatch.
Yeah.
I'm going to rattle them all off.
Sounds good.
So do you need any kind of experience? Where do you sign up to volunteer? And is there a time commitment for volunteering? And can you participate only on the days that they are vocal?
I like these questions. These are good questions. Thank you. You do not need any experience. However, it is important that you make sure that you can hear. If you are hard of hearing or if you are deaf, it may not be the right program for you, since we do rely on hearing the amphibians in our yard. So keep that in mind. Your time commitment, once you attend a training session. So a training session is 3 hours long. All right. 3 hours is a long time, and I recognize that. That is your biggest commitment, is coming to one training session that is 3 hours long. After that, you only need to monitor 4 times in one season, so over the course of a summer, which involves 5 minutes of your time, literally 5 minutes of your time. You wait 2 minutes for the animals to acclimate. You listen for 3 minutes. You write what you hear in that 3 minutes. You submit the data, and you're done. So that's it. If you can have 20 minutes within a summer, and again, that's from February all the way through August, you're committed. When it comes to data, one thing that we emphasize in the training is not hearing amphibians is also valuable data. Not hearing amphibians is also valuable data, because part of this is also telling us, where are the frogs? Maybe 4 years ago, your area had 15 different species that were going off. Since then, maybe they built a massive mall, and now you're hearing 2 a couple times a month. So just because you're not hearing anything doesn't mean you're a failure. And I get that a lot. Well, I'm just not hearing anything, so I'm not monitoring. Still valuable data. There's no weighted heavier data that is more valuable than the other. All right. It's all very valuable. All right. What am I missing one?
No, I think you nailed it.
Yes.
So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. Let me talk about frogs.
Yes.
Stoked.
Yeah.
Hi guys, thanks for joining.
Thank you so much. And for everybody in Zoom land and tuned in live, thank you. This production will be available on our YouTube channel. It is on our Facebook page. And please sign up for FrogWatch and support the Brevard Zoo, and visit savetheirl.org for more information. Thank you.